just quickly before we get into this episode, if you want to help support the podcast, install Brave web browser for a better browsing experience, and have less trackers and stuff interrupting your browsing and collecting your data and all that weird creepy stuff. So download Brave at brave.com/PEP424, PEP 424. This episode is with my friend Rob. We go into a lot of stuff about sort of, I guess, robots, technology, and transhumanism, and sort of the future of our relationship with technology. So enjoy. Hello and welcome to Peppermint Philosophy. Today I'm joined by my boy Rob from Peppermint Chill. Check us out at peppermintphilosophypodcast.com or on Spotify or Amazon, and sometime soon probably iTunes as well. But I'm joined by Rob today. Say hello, Rob.
Hello.
And we're going to discuss, I guess, robots, cyborgs, and transhumanism, because recently we've kind of been having discussions about this kind of stuff by text, and it was just sort of like, why not? Let's just have a fucking podcast and just discuss this stuff and flesh out in more detail.
Yeah, we thought we were wasting perfectly good material on WhatsApp when we could be recording it and putting it out there.
Well, exactly. And these, to be honest, like as just like a pre-caveat to this conversation, I think these are actually important conversations to have because, all of this technology is kind of on our doorsteps. It's in its infancy at the moment, but, human advancement happens very quickly. We've known that from the last sort of 150 years. So we should start having these conversations now, in my opinion, and just sort of lay down the foundations to how we're going to deal with it.
Yeah, the way I have kind of envisioned this, I pitched it to Adam as a sort of interview, I suppose you could call it, but not strictly that formal. Because Adam, you're much more knowledgeable about this than I am. I think you've read into it a lot more than I have more recently, whereas I've only just heard about it in the past couple of days, really. Obviously, there's peripheral stuff that everyone knows about when it comes to robots and cyborgs and that sort of thing. But some more of the detailed stuff, that's what we're going to discuss today. And
Right.
I thought I'd just start with asking you to sum up what transhumanism is and what its tenets are. I suppose that might be too formal a word, but what the general thought behind it is, and where people who, they don't necessarily define themselves as transhumanists, but people who are of the ilk that, or of the belief that AI is the future. What's the general philosophy behind that?
Okay, so just as like before we go into this, I am by no means an expert, nor am I an advocate. In fact, I'm quite the opposite of this. But I'm definitely not an expert in transhumanism. I'm not an expert in AI. I'm not an expert in technology even. It's just sort of stuff I'm interested in, as I think most people are. But sure, I'll give you my sort of overview of what transhumanism is as I perceive it. And
yeah.
So I think transhumanism is kind of this movement, which it's philosophical, technological, and I guess sort of cultural movement, which is seeking to kind of develop humanity beyond humanity. So that sounds kind of woo-woo, but essentially it's kind of, the idea behind it is that you take advantage of technologies and maybe even things like drugs, things that we discover which can improve the human condition to the point where, you treat every ailment as some kind of thing that can be treated. So that goes towards things like the limitations of human intellect. That goes to things like the limitations of human physiology. That goes to things like the seeking of pleasure, the removal of suffering as much as possible. So those, I suppose, are the more those are the noble goals of transhumanism. And I think to an extent, those are things no one really disagrees with, because, really the pursuit of human advancement is to remove as much suffering as possible, is to enhance our experience, and is to try and become the best versions of ourselves that we can be. What I think so the interesting thing is that transhumanism is looking to do that through technology and discovery, which is interesting, but I think that when this kind of thing was conceived, it was conceived at a time when we didn't really understand necessarily what it was like to live in this kind of society that was beyond humanism. So I'd say that arguably we are in the first sort of phases of transhumanism. We are going, especially in like the Western world, we are going beyond what it is to be human. We are going beyond that sort of ability to understand, I suppose, a more natural form of suffering. And I think that actually, and this is purely anecdotal, and I think, and don't hold me to it, but I do think that we are starting to see certain ramifications from moving away from that more sort of, I don't want to say natural, because to say natural has these sort of connotations of being kind of, for lack of a better term, woo-woo, but, it's that I think that we're moving away from what it means to be human, and I think that that's detrimental to us. And because, as dumb as it sounds, we are human beings, we need a certain level of what it means to be a natural human being in order to live happily, healthily, and enjoyably, I suppose. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. When you're thinking about transhumanism, do you think that includes genetic modification as well?
Okay, so genetic modification, yes, it does, of course. So it's taking advantage of technologies and techniques. So anything. So where I'd say it differs from most people, I suppose, is that I think most people would not deem, unless, say, you had strongly religious foundations or some other reason for viewing genetic modification negatively, most people would say that genetic modification applied to things like genetic disorders, things like that, is perfectly fine. Where I think transhumanism would take it, and again, I'm not a transhumanist. I don't believe in it. I don't think it's really a good idea. But I'd say that transhumanism, if you're taking it as like to its philosophical end, would be a case of, yes, you take advantage of genetic modification for whatever ends you want. So that would mean being able to genetically modify yourself to be better in some way, to get rid of, maybe you want to be a faster runner, you want to be stronger, you want to be able to breathe underwater, that kind of stuff.
Okay. Well, we might get into that a little bit later, but I think for this one, we're just going to focus on, I suppose technological isn't the correct word because bioengineering is still technology. But what I suppose, to put it crudely, you'd call robots and AI.
Right.
So one belief that transhumanists have is that one day we won't need a body anymore.
I see in some ways the bleakest version of the future is that we're moving in that direction. I think there is an obsession with this idea of wanting to link ourselves more to the technology we create. So I think that, so it's weird because I think that what we're seeking in transhumanism is to be more like our creations. So we see limitations in the way that, so we've evolved to have these brains which can cope with a certain number of people, a certain number of situations. We're comfortable within, a small select group of people, an amount of data that we can take in and process before we become overwhelmed, right? So, there's that whole saying of, we are, what's the term? Herding people. Our brains are designed to count sheep in the hundreds kind of thing, but we're working with numbers that are in, the billions and trillions and all of this sort of stuff when it comes to computers and data. And so I think that there's this obsession almost with not only transhumanists, but also people today in general looking to, they're seeking this kind of integration with technology. We want to become the computer because we almost admire the ability of the computer to provide us with this sort of, they have this endless stream of data. They can process it really quickly. If you linked up to a computer, let's say, you'd be able to potentially download the entire fucking, database of Wikipedia or something like that in seconds. And I think that there are people who are obsessed with that idea. We're seeing that with things like Neuralink and Elon Musk and others discussing.
We're going to get onto
idea.
Neuralink a bit later. I've got that as a note,
I think it ties into this idea that we are becoming almost obsessed with this idea that we can become more like computers. But in doing so, we're forgetting the fact that actually we are human beings, we are animals, and we are limited. And that I think when you try to marry those two things up, so you're half and half, I think we're going to find... And I don't think that this is kind of an idea that's novel. I think that many people, if you look at like art, film, television, all of the things that kind of explore this question of trying to link technology and humanity, it always comes to a head where we don't actually feel the fulfillment we think we're going to feel. It comes to that question of, what is utopia? And utopia in the mind of like Sir Thomas More, I think it was, who wrote the original book that was titled Utopia. It was a society that achieves the best it can, but it strives to keep on achieving. So it's like there's always going to be a problem, but it's a society that is based on overcoming those problems and moving on to the next one. And I think there's always those problems. And transhumanism sees, and at least this is my interpretation from the outside looking in, it sees an end goal. It's like, well, if there's suffering, use technology to solve that problem. Use whatever we can find to get rid of that suffering. And maybe there is a point where it's like, let's move on to the next thing after that. But I think it will come to a fundamental head where we realize that our relationship with these technologies is taking away from the actual human experience.
Yes. At what point have we changed to a stage that we are no longer what we were before?
I think it's happening right now.
Yeah.
And I think, that might sound a bit dramatic, but, we're growing up in an age, you and me, we grew up in an age where a lot of these technologies weren't available to us. We still had, I suppose, what you'd call a normal childhood, where we weren't surrounded by telephones, iPads, and all that sort of shit. And we grew up, playing and doing all this sort of stuff. But there are children today who grew up with an iPad,
Oh, it amazes me seeing 10-year-olds on a smartphone.
Right. I mean, I don't know if it was for you, but I got my first phone when I was like 15, 16, and it was like a BlackBerry. It was like the very basic smartphones, and
I didn't get a smartphone until I was nearly 20.
You know what? That was probably the right idea. I think my parents wanted to hold out for that, but I was a real naggy bastard.
Yeah, I didn't even use most of the features until I was 21, when I started university and got shown how to use the stuff.
I mean, yeah, and without, I don't want to rag on transhumanism too much. So I think that the origins are noble, because I think when you look at people who have, say, genetic disorders or brain damage or things like that, where technology can alleviate that suffering, I 100% agree that should be done. If we can find a way to safely do that, that's great. The problem is that I think that there is certainly a school of thought in transhumanism that believes if it's totally available, it should be used for whatever end possible.
What would you say as a counterpoint to the people who say human beings as we are now, we're flawed, we're illogical, we're weak, we get ill, we fall apart, we become burdens to other people, we can have things go wrong with us just out of pure bad luck. And because of our illogical nature, we do terrible things to each other. What do you say to the people who would argue that's why we want to change human beings?
I mean, that's a perfectly good point, but I'd say that's part of being human, right? So this might get a bit, this might be a bit out there, but bear with me. So So I think that human beings are imperfect. We're destined to be imperfect, and that's the best way we can be. Because imperfection essentially means that we have the ability to detach from nature. We don't have to live in total accordance with it. We have the ability to do great evil, but we also have the ability to do great good as well. And so, there might be certain things which live in accordance with nature. Like, so you see, say, I don't know, a bee stung me the other day, right? Do I think that bee, in doing that, do I believe that was an evil act? Like, no, the bee was defending its territory. It might have hurt me and I got angry about it, but what it was doing was following its nature. It was living in accordance with nature. When you see ants tearing up termites or whatever it might be in the middle of the rainforest, you don't consider that evil. It's just an ant doing what an ant does. These things are living in total accordance with nature. They're not good or evil. They are perfect in that realm. So to me, perfection is when you're living in total accordance with nature. You are absent of good and evil. Humans, on the other hand, we are imperfect, and I think that's the point of humanity. I think that's what gives humanity zest and life. I think in our imperfection, we can be good, we can be bad, and everything in between. Humanity, it's very easy to point out the bad things that humanity does, the evils that humanity does, because we've evolved to remember bad things more readily than good things. But there are just as many good things that happen. People volunteer their time to, feed homeless people. They do nice things to each other. They give people compliments. Even these small good things that people do, they are because we are imperfect. And I think that we look at it now from a human perspective of, if we rid ourselves of these imperfections, it's all going to be good. But I actually think it's all going to be just one color. You're no longer going to have a spectrum of really good to really bad and everything in between. You're just going to have something bland and in the middle, where we live in this total logic, which, might sound appealing when we live in a world that's very uncertain and when we're bombarded with bad news all the time. But I think that it's short-sighted to think that that's the answer, because what's the point in living? Maybe if we transcend to being this transhuman, then maybe it won't even matter. It probably won't even matter anymore, because we've achieved a point in which we just don't care about good or evil. We essentially become the computer. What's the difference then between us and an ant, or us and even a computer, which computers arguably live in total accordance with their nature? They do as they're commanded. They don't have free choice. They just do what they do because that's what they're programmed to do. Do we want to be that, or do we want to be something that has potential for anything?
There's also the fact that it's struggle that has often driven the best in humanity. The fact that we've achieved so much is quite often down to the terrible situations we found ourselves in history.
Definitely.
You've only got to look at the innovations that came during the Second World War to see that.
Exactly, yeah. And it's even let's take it, that's a great example of it, but even on a day-to-day basis, people are struggling all over the world, and struggling and suffering, yes, it brings pain, it brings horror, and by all means that we should try and alleviate those things as much as possible. But there comes a point, I think, when you alleviate far too much suffering from your life, where you're living this kind of sterile existence. And this is why I say that we're living in the first stages of transhumanism. We are totally removing ourselves from what it means to be human in some ways. When you look at, and this might be anecdotal. I'm not going to say that there are studies on this. I've heard people talk about studies, but I've not read them, so don't take my word for it. But when you watch documentaries of, sort of hunter-gatherer tribes people who do sort of cultural exchanges with people in the Western developed world, they seem confused by our lifestyle. They're living this lifestyle which to us seems primitive, to us seems like a struggle because, they have to hunt their own food, gather things, they live with disease constantly. But they also have much more time off than us. They live a much more natural life. We might not understand their language, but they banter with each other. And, there's something to that kind of natural struggle which gives us that sort of humanity. I worry that we are using... so one thing that I heard, I think it was a guy called Duncan Trussell, and it was on a podcast, but he was discussing sort of our reliance on technology and how it's kind of become really weird how... And I don't know if you've noticed this, but I certainly have, that so many technologies don't seem to be making major strides anymore, i.e. major developments which are life-changing. They seem to be kind of small incremental changes which act more like digital crutches for things that we can do naturally just with a bit more effort. So one thing...
I'm trying to think what the last big innovation probably could be considered, and I think it would probably be the internet, wouldn't it? And that's 30 years ago now, isn't it?
I mean, arguably you could say smartphones, like the iPhone was a big jump. iPods as well, they were big jumps.
I suppose so, but that's more just a synergy of existing technology, isn't it? Of the internet and telecommunications.
Yeah, I'll give you that. I think, but the thing one thing that stands out for me is that, I was using things like Facebook and stuff to remember people's birthdays. Even now, I mean,
I just don't bother.
But this is the thing, is that like the birthdays I remember are the birthdays I knew before I had Facebook. So that's my family and some of my earliest friends and things like that. All of my new friends, I can maybe get a rough ballpark of when their birthday was, like in the month. I don't remember necessarily, what day it is. And it's like things like that where it's like we've kind of given away that ability because, it seems like a small thing, but it's like all of these things build up and we're kind of losing we're not necessarily losing it, but our ability to do these simple tasks, which require a little bit of effort, we're just giving over to technology for not really a good reason, in my opinion.
I think one symptom of that is I used to look at the calendar all the time when I was younger to keep up with dates and look at things that were coming up. It's you mentioning birthdays that made me think of that. We still have a calendar in the house. I never look at it, ever.
Well, exactly. Because it's there at the end of your wrist.
Yeah, but I, to be honest, I don't really use the calendar on my phone as much as I should because it's fiddly and a pain in the arse.
Yeah.
But I also, because I've got the phone and I can look things up, even though it might take longer than actually just walking over to the calendar and looking. I see what you mean about the fact that certain technologies might seem not as advanced, but they're still useful.
Yeah.
And in some ways more useful, because you write something on the calendar, unless the calendar, someone takes it off the wall or the house catches fire, it's going to be there, isn't it? In the same place, on the same page. And then everything new that you add to it will stay there. Your calendar's not going to run out of battery.
Well, exactly. And I think so. I think one thing that's like, and it may, again, I'm fairly sure I've heard people say that there are studies of this. I've never read them, so that's the caveat of this. But I do believe that there is something more to actually physically writing something down and doing that sort of like mind, muscle, memory type stuff. So like whenever I write notes, I remember them better, in my opinion, than when I type them up on a computer.
Oh, absolutely.
Or type them into my phone. And I think there is something about doing things which is more important than... And yes, to an extent, if you're typing it into your laptop or on your phone, you are doing it, but I don't think it's the same kind of connection. Does that make sense?
In jobs I've had in the past, I've had to take minutes for meetings, and I've done it on both a laptop and a paper, and I found I could remember it much better from the notes on the paper than if I was looking back over it on the laptop to try and tidy it up if I'd gone back to it a week later, for example. My written minutes, I had no problem. If I'd written something that wasn't entirely clear, or I wrote something that I thought might need elaborating on a little bit more, I knew exactly what it was.
Right.
It wasn't the same with typed up. I think because as well, when you're typing up, you're focusing so much on getting it correct on the screen because you can see all the mistakes appearing in front of you, can't you? If there's a double space or a spelling mistake or anything like that, and you're going back and trying to correct that. This might just be me, but it's not as simple as just scribbling it out as fast as you can. And you're almost reading it as you're doing it, aren't you? Because you're putting the letters on yourself rather than just hitting a button, hitting buttons in succession.
No, I'm in total agreement with that. I think that, I agree with all of that stuff, like scribbling out especially. It seems like such a quick thing to do and then just move on. But I think that there are things like that we're relying a bit too much on technology. I think, sure, maybe that's just because you and we grew up writing stuff rather than typing it. Maybe people growing up today who type more than they write will not have that same kind of problem because they've developed with it.
Yeah.
That's perfectly possible as well.
Something that amazes me is the fact that some people will never physically write a shopping list. They will use the memo app on their phone. And I just think that just seems like so much unnecessary extra steps. Yes, you save paper. Yes, you don't find it in the bottom of your pocket 2 weeks later. But still, it's just so easy to have a scrap of paper to just unfold and flick through.
Yeah, and maybe that's just because I guess we're moving into a phase of being old men.
Yeah.
And I do respect that that's kind of... I mean, yeah, I do respect that that's a part of it. But I don't know, I just feel that there... And this might just be me being pessimistic. I think there are unintended consequences of marrying ourselves too close to this technology when we are still beings that exist on certain limitations. I think that's perfectly fine. I think that there's almost like this obsession with having to advance all the time, constantly. Yeah. And we can't necessarily settle on the fact that maybe we have advanced to a point where we can just enjoy what it is to be human, you know?
There's also the fact that you lose certain skills by relying on technology as well. And I think the most clear one is spelling, which is ironic considering how hot certain people are on correcting people's grammatical and spelling errors on social media. And I think the reason for that is because of spell check and people are more unforgiving of it. But if you were asking them to write out the word, they would probably... People's spelling would not be as good.
Yeah. And
you can see that when spell check fails. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big factor. I think also the fact that, I don't know, this is purely a guess, but I don't think people read as much as they used to. Despite the fact that far more people can read today. Not as many people. But for the percentage of the people that are literate, I would say the percentage of that literate population that actually read is probably far less than in the past. And I'm not talking about before the advent of mass media. I'm talking 30 years ago or 50 years ago.
No, I agree. I mean, me, even I didn't properly read a book on my own, like a proper book, probably until I was, in my teens, maybe like 13, something like that.
Really? Did you never read kids' books?
Well, I read little, like short kids' books.
Did you not read Roald Dahl?
No, I got about halfway through Danny, Champion of the World, and then
that's a dead short one.
It is, yeah, right. No, but this is the point: is that it's like I almost fell into that. I read tons now. I fucking love reading. In some ways, it's better that I had that because now I've realized what I was missing out on. I'm like, shit, I need to catch up, and that's great. But I do agree that I think that's maybe the flip side is that people realize later on that actually they missed out on tons of stuff. And then kind of almost, and this is my hope with all of this kind of stuff, is that there's going to be some kind of counterculture. And I think it is happening at the moment where people are fed up with the reliance on technology. And they're starting to make changes to reduce their reliance on technology. I think that's brilliant. I encourage people to do it, just even if it's just to try it and just see what it's like, I guess, to live a more old-timey life. I mean, even saying that seems ridiculous, because it was like 15 years ago, it was way less reliant on technology all the time. I think that's happening. I think it's going to grow, because I think a lot more people find the benefits of reading a book. Even reading a book on paper, I can barely keep my attention on a screen.
Oh, I never read anything on a screen. The only thing I've read on a screen, actually, is I read A Study in Scarlet, the Sherlock Holmes book, on my phone, because I had a free book app. And every time I was sat waiting for something, in a queue or something, I would just pop it out and read a few pages.
That was exactly the same book as well. In fact, I read A Study in Scarlet and the one after, and a bunch of the short stories on my phone, because I got them all for free. But
now we're promoting technology.
But that was, so that's the good side of it. And of course there are certain things that I will read online sometimes, but my attention is much better on pages. I can read a book on page a lot better, and that might be different for other people, and that's fair enough. Whatever gets you reading is good, in my opinion. But to me, I love the feel of a book. I love flicking the pages. One thing for me is that I love knowing how far through the book I am, because you don't get the same kind of grasp on it when you're flicking through like a Kindle or something. Even though it says the page number, it doesn't feel the same, because you can kind of see when you put your bookmark in how far through you are.
Do you find you read faster as you get towards the end of the book?
Yeah, well, I find that I'm more likely to stick with the book. So yes. I noticed that in the first sort of half of the book, it's a bit lagging, but as soon as I get over the halfway point, I'm then like, shit, I'm getting towards the end now. It's the home stretch.
Yeah, if I ever get to the last 50 pages in a book, I tend to read them all in one go.
Yeah.
But to bring it back more to closer to the topic that we are focusing on, you were discussing earlier about medical applications for people who have suffered accidents or perhaps born with disabilities. What's your thoughts on the suggestion that future prostheses will be superior to natural human limbs? For example, bionic eyes, bionic arms.
Right.
Do you think that is potentially negative, or do you think that's a section of the, I suppose you could call that a kind of mid-stage of, or I said early to mid-stage of transhumanism?
Right. So I think it's always a struggle, right? So with people who need these things, I totally sympathize with the idea of, like, missing a limb. If you can get a new limb, that's amazing. That's what we strive for. We should be developing that technology so people who lose their limbs still have, they can get functional limbs. And whether that's eyes and stuff, that's brilliant. Being able to hear when you're deaf, again,
there's even
tremendous.
Talk, I remember a few years ago, talk of them developing a kind of robotic pancreas for people with type 1 diabetes.
Again, those are the reasons that we strive for these things, and they are those are the just reasons for those technologies. But I do worry that there is this other side, and it's the transhumanist side, where it's like, let's go beyond humanity, which is the bit I fear, where it's if these limbs are available, then why can't I just have them so that I can run faster or jump higher or lift more or whatever it is? And I think that, as appealing as that sounds to someone, and if the technology is available, of course people will do it. People get plastic surgery and stuff, and yes, there are, again, with plastic surgeries or cosmetic surgeries, there are real there are the applications for that for people who have suffered, burn victims, people who have certain conditions. It's very important for them to, or even missing ears and things like that, or a missing nose. There are reasons for cosmetic surgery, but then there's also a side of it, which is the dark side of it, where you have people, and I'm not saying this is everyone, but people who are dissatisfied with their appearance. And you have some people who say, well, it's fine. They have this technology available that can make them feel better about themselves. But then there's also the side of it. It's like, well, what's the origin of the reason that they feel bad about themselves? Is it more a mental health problem? And I think that it gets really close to that sort of territory with this kind of idea of, well, maybe if the prostheses are available, then I can just have them anyway because I want to be strong. I want to be this. And I think it, again, with a lot of these types of things where it's like cosmetic or in this case,
augmentation.
Yeah. I think that there will come a point where one of the best things about getting stronger, getting faster, getting healthier, getting fitter is the fact that you got there. It's the fact that you put in the work to get to that point. And I think that people who have this short-sighted view, and I don't want to be like offensive to these people, but who think, well, I can get it just like that. If that were to happen, I think you'd be hugely dissatisfied in the long term because like with a lot of technology today, once you get it, you're waiting for the next thing to come out. You're waiting for the next thing, the next upgrade, the next advancement, rather than focusing on what you have. You know, it's like when you're super rich and you buy a Ferrari, you're driving it around, you're enjoying it for a bit. And that might have been your goal, say when you were a kid and you were poor and you were like, I want a Ferrari, let's say. And then you get all this money, you buy your Ferrari, you enjoy it. You think from your childhood to that point, that was the epitome of your life. Then you get the Ferrari, you drive it around. You realize it isn't good for carrying shopping. You know, all these things.
You realize you still can't drive it past the speed limit.
Yeah, right. And then suddenly it's then on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. I worry that there might be this kind of blowback where you just end up getting more into this upgrade culture with things which were meant for perfectly legitimate reasons.
Do you think that there might be a way of dealing with it in the future? Do you think there might be, I don't know, legislation or bans passed? Do you think they might look at augmentation of body parts as opposed to, you know, prostheses to replace something missing or damaged? Do you think they may look at augmentation the same way today we look at performance-enhancing drugs?
Yeah, I think they have to. I think, and this might sound a bit, overzealous, but I do think that it's something that we need to consider because you get into this weird territory, especially, and this is genetic enhancements and stuff come into this as well, and having the free reign of choosing your genetics, things like that. It lumps into this whole kind of aspect of, we call it, it might be I don't want to associate this with transhumanism, but you almost get to this point where it's this weird, like, neo-techno eugenics almost, where you're moving towards becoming a superior being through augmentation of your genetics by whatever means that would be, and in my opinion, who's to say what's best? That's the point. Eugenics, it is in some ways a form of eugenics because you are, even by offering the ability to change, and I don't want to lean too heavily on genetics because that's potentially a bit of a different conversation, but I think it works with this as an example. Like designer babies, people throw that around a lot. But what does that really mean? It's like you're choosing the genetics of your kid to, improve their ability to do this, that, and the other. And how is that any different from the ideas of, selecting certain traits which are considered superior? And who are we to say what is and what isn't? And surely the beauty of life is its diversity and its confusingness. And to some extent, yes, there are bad things that happen with that, and we should use these technologies to deal with those rather than our insecurities with ourselves.
You have a similar issue potentially with this sort of thing to designer babies as well, in that if that technology ever did become available, it's likely to be extremely expensive, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you could potentially end up with a kind of upper caste of these cyborgs who are so much more productive than the rest of society because of these augmentations they've been able to afford.
Right, and that's a fear with like Neuralink and things like that, in that the people who are going to get it first are going to be the rich people, and yes, eventually it might trickle down, like iPhones and stuff like that have done, and it might be even a short amount of time. But the first people who are able to do it, they'll have that advantage, even if it's the space of a year or 2 years.
It's funny that you mentioned Neuralink, because I hadn't actually considered that as a ramification of it, who it would actually be available to. But I think this is a good point to move on to it, because it was a point that I thought it was worth discussing. What are your thoughts on it, or do they differ much from what you've already said about other artificial prostheses or enhancements, or whatever you'd want to consider them, really, in regards to the fact that the purpose of Neuralink, at least initially, is to help people who've suffered neurological damage, and to, from what I understand, it's to send electrical currents into the brain to stimulate parts that have been left inert, essentially.
Yeah. So yeah, that's my understanding of it as well. Again, I think my opinion is pretty similar on most of these things. That is a very reasonable, reasonable approach. That is a noble approach. I agree 100% that yes, people with these kinds of diseases, conditions, this could be, potential. I mean, we talk about it like we're already talking about, and in a lot of the discussions you will hear are talking about, oh yeah, but it's going to be uploading yourself to the cloud and all this sort of shit. But, realistically, the experiments that they've done is that they've, as far as I know, is connected up these things to a pig's brain, and then they were able to get they were able to detect activity. Right, and it's it doesn't sound like much, but again, this technology expands rapidly. As results come in, they'll get more funding.
So does that mean they were reading the pig's thoughts in a very basic way?
I don't know. I don't know the exact details of it. I think that Elon Musk did a little, like, I guess, sort of talk on it, showing this activity. I think it was either detecting the activity or stimulating activity in the pig's brain. One or the other. I can't remember off the top of my head. But that's the state of the technology at the moment. The end goal of it, though, like you were saying, is to be able to stimulate the brain and reinvigorate activity in these areas so that people would be able to communicate better if they have brain damage, or move, be able to move their limbs if they've lost activity in that. So again, it's totally noble origin. Now, where does it get a bit where does it divert from that? What worries me is that Elon Musk has already talked about this. A lot of people have already talked about it. They're already, this is what Neuralink is being discussed in the frame of, which I think is quite sad, because what it should be discussed more about is its noble applications, but it's being discussed in terms of enhancing the human and being able to process things like a computer, being able to process this data, and even to the point of being able to communicate in a way that's transcendent of how we communicate, not by voice, but by thoughts. It's very similar to this kind of, whenever these aliens have appeared in people's abduction stories, they've always communicated by telepathy. And essentially it'd be a form of telepathy, right? It'd be communicating through waves, through this Neuralink. And that's very sci-fi and stuff, but that's kind of what they're talking about with this. My worry is that, it links back to this kind of idea of we are trying to become our creation. We almost have this weird, and this might be me trying to associate this in too much of a human way, but I feel like there is an envy at the ability of our devices to process things much better than we can. As the technology has improved in how it can process, how much storage and stuff you can have, we've remained the same. And I think there are people who want to catch up with that because they envy the position, maybe not consciously, but I think subconsciously they envy the ability of computers to do these things. And I think it's that we're seeking to be our computers, But at the same time, we fear that our computers will seek to be us. And that we'll go into that maybe in a bit more detail about AI. But when it comes to the Neuralink thing, I think that's the main issue, is that it does have this transhumanist, almost blatantly so, veneer to it, where they're talking about, oh yeah, well, at some point this technology will be available to everyone. You can just get it plugged in. And, it will be people like Elon Musk, the rich people who will get it first. And they will have an advantage if it works as good as they claim it will do in the future. Then they will have an advantage and be able to take advantage of that early forming system, just like people took advantage of the internet when it first came about.
What do you think will happen if it is possible? I'm not saying to the stage where you're downloading your entire brain into it or anything that advanced, or even when Elon Musk when he was discussing it in one place said the stage where you wouldn't even need to talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
But just perhaps at the stage where it's like having a smartphone directly in your brain, so you've got access to information from the internet, for example, or you can send an email using your brain. Do you think that's going too far?
Yes, I'd say that we can already do that. It just requires a bit of effort. And I think, again, the big problem with doing stuff like that is that, yes, it sounds cool, but it's pushing us more and more away from what it is to be human. We're leaning more and more on these digital crutches. And I think that is probably the more realistic goal, i.e. that's probably what we'll see coming out first, is that kind of ability to access the internet inside your own head and to send emails, things like that, which sounds like really cool and sci-fi and stuff, but at the same time, what's the point? Like, it's one of these incremental, unneeded technological advancements, which doesn't actually contribute anything to society, in my opinion. It's a convenience for people who can afford it. And I'd argue that actually they'd probably end up more miserable as a result, because suddenly, at least with a laptop or something, you can turn it off, you can move away from it, but this is going to be in your head all the time. You will constantly be connected to these platforms, to your emails, to all of this sort of stuff, if that's what ends up happening. Do you really want that?
Would this not be something that could be removed then? Would it be something that once it's in, it's in?
Well, by the sounds of it, what they're planning on doing is that you cut out a piece of the skull and put this in place of it. So it'd be kind of like, when they lift Data's hair up and it's got it'd be like that, right? And it's attached to your brain from that sort of pod.
Yeah.
So removing it would probably be a pain in the arse.
What I'm thinking is, for example, when they've got it to the stage where you can get information straight from it, if they ever got to that stage, so they've got beyond the medical application for it, and they've introduced I suppose you could call it a practical application for it beyond what's medicinal. And you've got a scientist or an engineer or a banker, even any position where you need large amounts of information at any given time. They have a bunch of papers that they want to read through. Say they're a scientist that colleagues have sent them, and they want to read all these, for example, to give a presentation on them or to discuss them at a seminar or to apply them to their own work. They use the link to almost absorb this data, I suppose, by, I suppose you could say, reading it digitally in the way a computer might. Or it's perhaps something more important than that. It's something where they need to absorb a large amount of information for a certain amount of time, but then might not need it afterwards for a certain amount of time afterwards. So they absorb the information very quickly, remove the device, plug up the hole, if there were a way of temporarily plugging it up, because I imagine at the moment the only way of doing it would be putting a metal plate on the skull.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that would be an acceptable form of using it? Essentially, as using it as a means of absorbing information at a rate that we just aren't capable of doing at the moment.
No, I don't think that's acceptable. And again, that might just be me being a Puritan, but it's even I find the idea that we already kind of have this ability to tune in constantly with our phones, and I have a phone, I use the internet constantly, but I even worry about how much I use it.
We're still using our natural senses to absorb that information, though, aren't we? You might be, even the fastest reader can't read, more than a certain amount of words per minute, can they?
No, but someone, if you manage your time better and you use the time to prepare for it, say, for example, the presentation, surely it's better to construct that presentation over time, read the material, and then present it. You can still do it. It just means that you have to spend time to consider it and do it and manage your time better. And, it sounds really good that you can just download this stuff for a bit when you need it and then do away with it. But I think that would create this whole new aspect of human life where you would then just do that all the time instead of actually reading something and taking your time with it and processing it the way that a human brain is meant to do. And all of this is talking about it without understanding what, we have no idea what implications this will bring when you're downloading all of this data, but it's still connected to your brain. And can you really separate those out? And will we reach a point where we just overload our brains, where we just can't do it? And those are things that we'll probably find out. And I think it'll be quite messy. But
when you said overload our brains, I just thought of that scene from Scanners where the guy's head explodes.
Yeah, well, that's it. Because maybe it will be stuff like that. But I have concerns with just because you have these noble intentions. It's like, well, what if it's just for this? What if it's just for that? But then there are all of these unintended consequences of how that will affect you as a person, how that will change your approach to life. Because I don't know about you, but I'd probably just use that all the time because, well, fuck it. I don't need to revise for a test. I can just, 10 minutes before, plug in my Neuralink and then download all of the information.
Well, you would, wouldn't you? It's like the difference between, do you drive 5 miles to town in 10 minutes or do you spend 2 hours walking there?
Right, exactly. And it's like we will go, human nature goes for the path of least resistance, and we kind of have to resist that in some senses because sometimes the path of least resistance is the immediate problem, but the long-term problem is that we've got all of these unintended consequences which can really interfere with that ability. And I think that we need to start considering the wider implications of these kinds of technologies on a personal level, firstly, and then in turn that will transform into a societal level as well.
Why do you think the potential applications of Neuralink, for example, crosses a line? Or do you think there are technologies that already exist? Why is Neuralink and, for example, the potential ability to absorb large quantities of information very quickly, why is that different from, for example, the invention of the internal combustion engine, which meant that, for example, if you apply it to agriculture, it meant with a tractor you could plough a field and plant a seed in a field far faster than you ever could, and with far fewer hands than you ever could previously?
Right, that's a really good question. So I think, of course, there is a certain element of like, well, this is just the advance of technology, but I think the difference is that we're moving from advances in technology which assist practical things, i.e. things that have a meaningful purpose for human existence. So being able to farm more efficiently means that you can sustain a population much easier, and you can distribute the labor a lot better. You don't necessarily have to have tons of people going around picking stuff all the time. Things like that. It's still got a connection to survival. With things like Neuralink, I mean, even cars and stuff like that, it's improved our ability to transport things. It's brought us all closer together in a sense of we can now travel across the country, we can see things, but it's ultimately still got that connection to survival. I think things like Neuralink and technologies which, arguably even things like smartphones, they are moving more into this territory of it's no longer a case of survival, it's a case of convenience. And I think this convenience lifestyle, it was good when it was, convenience of survival. The fridge is a perfect example of it. The fridge is a great invention because it means that you can store food for a long time. You don't have to buy something every day. It saves you time there. But I also think that it's important that you cook, right? You need to be able to cook so that you know how to survive on cooking food, preparing food, and so on. And I think there's a difference between those kinds of skills. You can't just pawn off those survival skills, or you can't just not survival. You can't pawn off these kinds of unnecessary skills, I suppose. So the things that a lot of technology these days, just these digital crutches, you don't need them. It's just that they're convenient. Sorry, I went a bit all over the place there.
Do you not think you're making a similar point to the people who, in the late 19th century, said you don't need electric lights?
Oh, no, I 100% am. But I would say, and that's a perfectly reasonable retort, but I would say that I think the long-term consequences of this are different. Because those kinds of advances in technology, I think, they are based in the improvement of people's lives in general, the improvement of producing, preserving, things like that, survival-oriented things, rather than what will essentially be probably for a lot of the early users a way of essentially getting ahead of the game in business and stock markets and things like that, where it's like, well, really, does that have any human value? And eventually, yes, it might trickle down and mean that we end up in this society of weird people who sit there in silence communicating via telepathy of some sort. But, and this, I mean, again, this is very sci-fi, very weird kind of, and maybe it's taking it too far. Maybe it wouldn't reach that point. But, think of all of the things that would be lost in that kind of a world,
Elon Musk
music.
reckons it's only decades away.
Oh, I mean, yeah, people say that, and it's like, I mean, yeah, but I think that there is actually, like I said before, I think there is this counterculture brewing. I think that there will be a hard break on it very soon because, think about things like music, things, enjoying, poetry even, things, and yes, maybe the art and stuff will evolve with the technology. But I think that there's a connection to the physical that's important, and it's possessing these things, creating sounds, creating works of art, poetry, literature. It's important because it's, books were meant to be read over a long period of time, not downloaded in seconds. You're meant to enjoy it, spend time with it, weeks, maybe even months if it's like this really big book or, whatever it might be. It's meant to be. It's like saying, would you rather sip a coffee or just take a caffeine pill?
Or just neck the whole thing in one gulp.
Right, yeah, but I mean, would you rather be able to get the instant buzz of caffeine or sip your coffee and enjoy it? I think that's the kind of point that we're at with this. I think that's why I have an aversion to things like Neuralink if it's going to be used in that sense. So I just think it would just take away from the human experience. I don't think it will kick off because of stuff like that, but you never know. You never know.
Okay. Well, we started talking a little bit about the technological advance of, for lack of a better word, appliances. and that's the next thing I've got down here, is away from augmentation of our own physical bodies to the creation of, well, robots, I suppose.
Yeah.
The creation of more and more sophisticated machinery to perform tasks for us.
Yeah.
And what we were discussing in our chats we were mentioning about before that inspired us to do this was, I said I would quite like it first got onto it because we were listening to a podcast where it was talking about sex robots, and we'll get onto those a bit later. But we, after that, started discussing a more, I suppose you could say, benign use of a, for lack of a better word, robot assistant. And I said I would like to have a robot that could cook and clean for me.
Yeah.
And you didn't think that was a good idea.
No. I mean, look, so I can understand where it comes from. I fucking hate cleaning. There are sometimes I really hate cooking. And, sometimes I will get a ready meal when I'm too lazy to cook. But I think that having a cooked meal is, that's the best thing. It's the amount of effort, the craft, knowing how to prepare food and stuff like that. It's important. I think that those are, earlier I was talking about like the survival stuff, and I think maybe in some ways I kind of misspoke a little bit, because yes, a lot of technology was improving survival skills, but I think there are points where actually it's important for you to have those survival skills instead of the technology.
Well, so, I am just remembering now, in the previous Peppermint Philosophy I appeared in, I think it was that anyway, I did say how rewarding it feels to finish making a meal that perhaps one you've never done before, or one that's quite difficult, or not even difficult, just one you enjoy. One where you've had to put a bit of effort into it.
Right.
So, it is rewarding.
I'm curious, what is your thought on having a robot that cooks and cleans for you?
I suppose it would just be to have a form of device that you could just turn on and perhaps program in what you would like for dinner. You'd have to obviously make sure you had the ingredients, and it then knows, based off that, how to prepare the meal and make it for you and then present it for you at the end. It wouldn't necessarily be, I suppose for some people it would, but for me it wouldn't necessarily be a cooking replacement. It would just be there as an option. Yeah. And it would be the same for cleaning as well, because I think cleaning is far less important than cooking as a skill. Because, let's be honest, cleaning it's not a modern thing. That's wrong to say, but when we were living as hunter-gatherers, cleanliness was not really a huge consideration, was it? Obviously, we wanted to avoid human waste and dead bodies and anything that might have disease in it, effectively, rotten meat. We didn't want to make sure our food got contaminated or our water got contaminated. But beyond that, personal hygiene and general cleanliness wasn't really a thing, was it? It's a very modern idea to live in a sanitary environment.
So I'm not sure if I agree with that, because, so hear me out here. I think that cleaning originates from the fact that when you're living in a wild environment, you kind of have to keep the wilderness out of where you're living, right? Because so insects and things might destroy your materials. Animals might burrow into your house and things like that. I'm reminded of, in a book called, sorry, it's on my bookshelf. Mad White Giant by Benedict Allen. He was an adventurer and he went to the Amazon and just sort of traveled across the basin, meeting indigenous people and using them as guide, and asking them for help to guide him through the rainforest. And one of the people that he meets, it was before he got into the heart of the Amazon, was this, I think it was this German guy called Fritz. who was living in the jungle, and he'd built a house there, and he was talking about how he had a routine where he'd clean daily in the mornings and the evenings to keep out the jungle, essentially animals, so like the ants and the various insects and the spiders and stuff like that, and the snakes and things like that. And he was saying, I think he said something like, it's a constant battle to keep the Amazon out of my house. And I think that's kind of where, maybe this is maybe looking a bit too into it, but I think the origins of cleaning come from those types of things. You don't want to allow your home to become too, or the place where you're living to become too encroached on by the wilderness, or to become dirty or messy. There are things like, it's important to keep your house clean because if you have too much dust, you'll get house dust mites and various weird insects, clothes moths, things like that. And I think it is important as a survival skill to know how to clean and when to clean and things like that. Maybe that's looking too much into it.
No, I see where you're coming from. But I still think the way I look at it is, for example, someone who's wealthy enough to afford a cleaner or a maid, or even aristocrats in the past. They would never cook in their life or clean in their life. But they didn't mean they lived completely meaningless lives or listless lives. And I just think having something that could do small, tedious tasks that you don't put much personal importance into, but you have to do for the sake of your own health and well-being, could be a good thing in certain circumstances.
Yeah, but I see. Maybe it's because I've got this aversion to these things. I do think I'm starting to believe more and more that these kinds of things that we consider menial are important foundations for ourselves as human beings. I think it's important that we stay on top of things, and yes, we can get other things or other people to do those things for us, and we can feel in control of it. But I think that then you can suddenly be thrown into a situation, say if you are wealthy and you can afford a cleaner, suddenly you lose all your wealth, you can't afford the cleaner, and then your house becomes messy and you don't know what to do. And maybe that's an extreme example, but
I think it is, because these things are not difficult to learn if you are thrown in that situation.
No, but I think it's that, having a routine and being able to, those things are important, I think, in whether it's cleaning, cooking, washing your dishes, things like that. I think it's important to drill it into yourself to keep your space clean, tidy. And I'm saying this as someone who often falls into bouts of messiness, and I know I should be doing better, but I also feel that when I'm in a clean environment, it's better. I know that I've done it. And now, sure, maybe I could supplement that with a robot maid, I guess, but I don't know. I worry that our almost marriage to technology is then meaning that it's almost influencing our ability to have, or it will potentially change our ability to have personal relationships in the same way. Because I feel that an important part often sometimes of building a relationship is finding someone who complements things that you're lacking in, or that you need them to help you become better or something like that. And I feel that sometimes when we are supplementing our lives and our characteristics with technologies and this sort of thing, we can miss out on those character traits in people.
Yeah, this is where I lost you a little bit.
Yeah.
In the discussion, because my retort to that was essentially, why have any modern conveniences then, effectively? Why not still wash our clothes in a basin in the back garden and then dry them using a clothes mangle?
So I was thinking about this a little bit, and so in some ways it comes back to like the fridge thing, in that those technologies are kind of like, they aren't necessarily to replace a convenience.
No.
Okay, so I think that you make a really good point in that, it is difficult to tease apart these different technologies from each other, but I'd say that at least with like a washing machine or even a dishwasher, really, you still have to actually go and put the stuff in and go about with your day. And it's one of these technologies which maybe just gives you more time to do other things. Maybe it makes cleaning a bit quicker process. But I think the problem is that when you even just get someone else to do that aspect of it, it's almost going too far. And I admit, 100%, you're right in that I'm not really any different from, the people who contested electrical light bulbs and stuff like that. I think I'm definitely in that sort of category. But
or the Luddites destroying the textile mills. Although that was for their job security, actually,
right,
more than some deeper philosophy.
Right, but I do think it's almost like I feel that as much as it's pushing in this direction, I see where it's going. I just question how much, or how good it is for me and for people in general to move too far in this direction beyond what it is to live, I suppose, a more human lifestyle, having that connection with suffering, because I think that's important, and maybe this might be stretching it a bit beyond the remits of this conversation, but I do think that people who tend to suffer more, and this is purely anecdotal, tend to be hardier mentally, physically. Their threshold of suffering is much higher than other people who say, for example, like us, might be living in a more cushy lifestyle. And I'm not saying that's a good thing, because obviously I had to get through some suffering to get there, and some horrible suffering. But, the flip side of it, and I think what we're starting to understand more now is that when we live more in this, so there's things like the hygiene hypothesis, where living in too sterile an environment will make you more prone to allergies and stuff like that. I think that we're finding a similar kind of effect, but with mental illness. When you live in too cushioned an environment, too cushioned an upbringing, you're going to get, we might not see it yet, but this is my hunch. And again, don't quote me on it. I have no evidence to base this on. It's purely anecdotal, purely observational, I suppose. But I think that we're going to find that there will be more people with mental health issues, and potentially that's because we are living more and more of a lifestyle that is avoiding suffering instead of taking suffering head on.
Well, you see things nowadays, don't you? And I don't know if this is more common today at all, but when I hear things like people who get nervous talking on the phone, for example, people who don't have any other conditions, obviously if you're autistic or something, then you that might cause you difficulty and things like that. But I just mean people who are, for lack of a better word, regular people, but trivial things like that they get nervous about doing.
Well, I mean, you don't have to look any further. I am someone who gets nervous talking on the phone. I know that sounds stupid because I talk like a fucking train, going at 200 miles an hour. But I do, like, the idea, like, even, calling up someone for a takeaway, I find that being, like, I'd rather avoid that. But, again, it's one of these things that I have observed, and I'm like, actually, that is stupid. I do want to try and talk on the phone more. In fact, actually, when you talk to someone more directly on the phone, usually you'll get an answer much quicker than by an email or something like that. And so you can solve things a lot quicker. But I do agree that I think that's something that I've observed in my own life. I think a lot of people have that thing of being nervous on the phone. And it's kind of silly, really, because it's like, a pretty convenient way of being able to communicate with someone without the tedium of having to do it, essentially just send off an email and wait.
Yeah, it is harder ringing out than receiving a call. But I would say, like you say, in my old job, I had to talk on the phone a lot, usually receiving calls. But if I ever needed to speak to a colleague, I would always try and call them first because it was just more practical. If they were there to answer the phone, it was, especially with the nature of my job as well, if I could get an answer then and there, that was the ideal situation.
Exactly.
So it just made sense for me to do that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this is, in some ways, we've kind of touched on another kind of weird symptom of this march of technology, I suppose, in that, technology has made things more convenient, but maybe it's going to get to a point where it becomes inconvenient. It becomes more, I suppose, well, not more, less stressful to phone someone up, so you will send them an email, and what other little things like that will start popping up when we become more and more reliant on technology. And like you said, I mean, it is silly because you can get an answer so quickly. Most people, when they pick up the phone, aren't, they're not going to bite you. So it's like a weird nervousness that doesn't really make sense. But I think a lot of people are experiencing it.
You know what's funny, actually? I hadn't thought of this, but you talking now has just reminded me of it. I can't remember what it's called, but there's a kind of one of those laws, like they call them such and such is law or something like that. But it's basically a set of I suppose prepositions, basically saying that in text-based communication, anything said will always be interpreted in the most negative way possible.
Yeah.
Because you don't have that human interaction. And that's another reason I hadn't even thought of, that I used to be reticent to send emails if I could avoid them, because I was always paranoid that my email would be interpreted poorly.
Yeah. No, I that's definitely a thing, and you see that with like text messages and stuff. I don't know if you've ever had a thing where you message someone, like, especially if it's like, I mean, this might be, no, I won't even go there, but you message people, and then sometimes they like give you the cold shoulder, and then randomly you'll meet them in person, and maybe they'll just be like, "Oh, what the fuck do you mean by this?" And it's like, well, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just sending you a response. It's like the whole idea of, like, on Facebook you had the little thumb thing, and people are like, "Oh, that's a sassy thumb if you just respond with a thumb." It's like, I thought that was just a convenient way of saying yes, right? Apparently that's a thing where it's like the sassy thumb, and it's like, what?
Oh no! Well, it's like people say, "Oh, you shouldn't end an email with kind regards."
Right.
And I would say, if you think kind regards is an interpretation that they're unhappy, then you really need your head examining.
Yeah.
If someone's sending a snotty email, they're not going to... You'll tell from the tone of what they're writing that it's a snotty email.
And so, sometimes I have sent snotty emails and stuff, but my rule, I suppose, with that kind of thing is to try and give everyone the benefit of the doubt, because I know that I am more likely to interpret it as bad, or negative. And so you're right. It's one of these things. It's lost in communication.
Well, the thing is, though, most people don't really interpret an email either good or bad. They just read it, don't they?
Right. But let's say this is the way our brains are working. Let's say someone grows up with this technology. They're interpreting things in that way, and they start communicating in person like they're communicating via text, email, whatever. That's
like saying lol.
Right, yeah, but I mean, more the way that you're communicating online becomes the way that you communicate in person. This is kind of the thing that I fear with things like, how violent protests and stuff go, and how people think it's okay to just say really horrible things to each other in the streets without consequences. Like, well, no, you can get away with that online, but you can't get away with that in person. You shouldn't be able to get away with it. That's part of, living in a society. And I think as we become more reliant on technology, we're going to lose touch with those kinds of aspects. And maybe this is an argument that people were making 50 years ago about, I don't know, some new technology that was coming, the telephone, or what, any of these technologies. Maybe they came up with these similar arguments. I hope that it's a misplaced concern, but I fear that this is something which is changing what it means to be human, and I just think it's more important that we hold on to what we are rather than pursue something we're not, which I think comes on to, and I don't know if you want to go there now, but like the whole discussion of AI.
Yeah, we'll get onto that in a little bit.
Okay.
We won't move there just yet because I've got
Sure.
a couple more things to discuss on the topic of robots. But just on what you were saying then about the change in the way people behave with each other based on technology.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of people say social media has coarsened the discourse.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say it undoubtedly has, but traditional media forums like television have encouraged it by adopting the discourse on things like Twitter and applying it to programs like the program we've got here in the UK, Question Time, where they have politicians on a panel discussing and then they have an audience. Even in the past 10 years, the audience is far more rowdy. And it's the fault of the people who make the program because they don't tell the audience, if you have to behave yourself. We expect you to conduct yourself in a certain way. And the same goes for the guests as well, to a lesser extent as well. You can't have people shouting over each other. And I think to a certain extent it's because of how elitist certain broadcast institutions have become, and they look down on regular society and think they're too stupid to have a program where there's a forum for serious discussion, or they're just worried people just won't watch it.
Yeah, and
but
I think
the alternative of what they're doing is extremely negative because it's contributing towards this coarsening of the discourse.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I agree with all of that. They're definitely, it's one of these things, it's like, was it heroin? You're chasing the dragon, right? It's that kind of thing. They don't realize, they're chasing the dragon for that sort of like that short-term buzz, the revenue, the clicks, the shares, and all of that sort of stuff, and neglecting the fact that they are deconstructing their viewers over time by essentially buying into the same kind of bullshit that social media is. And it's a shame because at this point there's almost nowhere you can turn for that kind of civilized discourse, at least nowhere that's obvious. Because you're right, Question Time used to be about a serious discussion and the audience would have a chance to ask questions. Now it's become this kind of like political football match where people are just shouting and jeering, and it almost seems encouraged,
It's like, it looks like something from a period drama, doesn't it? It's like a cockfight, everyone's screaming. And
that was one thing I found really encouraging about. There was they called it the debate between Slavoj Žižek and Jordan Peterson, but it was more just a discussion. And, they had people, of course, there were people who were touting it as being like the Clash of the Titans shit. And they were like, it was really fucking weird because they were there just like cheering on their side. And they were basically just like, yeah, guys, this isn't what we're here to do. There are things that we agree on and things that we disagree on. We're just here to discuss those things. And things more like that is what we need. We don't need more of this kind of just fueling of the bullshit fire.
Yeah. Well, we've gone on a little bit of a tangent there.
We did, yeah.
But I didn't stop it because I thought it was an interesting point. How we got from robot chefs to that.
It's changing human behaviour.
Yeah. But I was going to ask next, just as an aside to that, so you don't agree with the idea of a kind of domestic servant robot. What about self-driving vehicles?
Yeah, I don't want that either. Look, I respect that people. This may happen. I just won't choose to have it if I can avoid it. Again, it's like one of these flavors of life. I understand the idea of self-driving cars saves people's lives from car crashes, from accidents, etc. Because you lose control. But there is something about being in control of a vehicle that's freeing. There's that whole kind of thing of like when you get your first car after you learn how to drive, suddenly it opens up the world to you and you can drive anywhere you want, you can go anywhere you want, you can do things that you couldn't do before. I think that's an important aspect of the human experience. And then being able to get cars or, you know, different vehicles which you like more, and there's that whole kind of culture behind that, which I think is, you know, I might not be a part of it, but I think it's really good, it's fun, it's interesting, and they should be allowed to do that. I don't think you can do that with self-driving cars. And I think, I mean, as much as people talk about, oh yeah, well, we can save all of these lives, you know, however many lives it is from car crashes and car accidents and stuff. But then when you compare the number of people who die from car accidents to the number of people who die from malaria every year, or TB every year, or smoking every year, it's like, why aren't we focusing on those things? Because they're killing, you know, fucking millions more people than car accidents.
What about... Sorry, carry on.
Well, and yet things like these technological advances, which will prevent, you know, not to say it's a minor number, but, you know, a much smaller number of deaths as a result of car accidents. It's like, you know, those are headline grabbing things, but there are these much bigger problems with society.
It's not to say those problems aren't being dealt with, though, just because they're making self-driving cars. But just to get on what I was going to ask you, the other argument for self-driving cars, or not just self-driving cars, any kind of self-operating vehicle, I suppose, mostly with cars, I suppose, at this point, though, is the ecological argument that it would, purely by the fact that you don't use your car most of the time unless you work in certain professions. It's mostly sat there on your drive doing nothing. If you had self-driving vehicles that were prevalent and were everywhere, you would effectively rent them like you would rent anything else. Well, like going and leasing a car, effectively. Yeah. And you would book it for however long you needed it. If you were in a city, for example, and you just needed it for your commute, it would almost be like getting a taxi to and from work. And then you would get out once you got home. You might even be carpooling with other people. I don't know how it would work, but that's the idea lots of people are proposing. The idea that these cars are just on the road, moving all the time, and you just grab them as you need them. Yeah. And as a result, you would need far fewer.
Yeah, I mean, it might work for some places. I get it, but I like the idea that you have the ability to get your own car, and especially when, you know, that makes sense in places, you know, really built up places. But then you go to somewhere, even in Wales, you know, with these, you know, massive roads that wind and twist and stuff like that, and it's like, how many self-driving cars are you going to have going up and down these places all the time? And
yeah, there are some very narrow roads. It's different based on. I think I was listening to something where they were discussing this recently, actually, saying how different countries are going to be able to deal with them differently. For example, America, their roads tend to be very long, very straight, and they have very few things like roundabouts, don't they? It's a lot of intersections, which are actually more dangerous for human drivers because people try and rush through them. But I don't know how, if that would be easier for a self-driving car, which isn't going to try and beat the red light. Yeah. But would they struggle more with the roundabout, for example?
Well, exactly. And I mean, again, these are things that are probably going to get ironed out. But I don't know. I mean, you drive more than me. Does the idea of self-driving cars appeal to you?
Yes, in the fact that I find driving quite tedious. But I think I'm not against it in principle, if it was safe, obviously. Mm-hmm. As long as you still had the option to own your own vehicle as well if you wanted. But you would probably end up with a situation where you would have maybe city centres would just any kind of human-driven vehicle, unless, for example, it's a delivery or it has a specific purpose, would be prohibited. Mm-hmm. I can imagine something like that happening, or you'd have certain roads where the traffic travels at very high speeds, where I think it's in the iRobot film even, isn't it? They've got a road like that, where, for example, you can't trust a human to go over a certain speed limit and it remains safe. But if you have the cars all driven by machines, all programmed the same way, going at the same speed, you could have them going much faster speeds just as safely.
Right.
But you obviously couldn't then put a human on that road.
Yeah.
That would be areas where I think you would find divergence, possibly, which would make owning your own vehicle more inconvenient.
Yeah. So it's one of these things. I'm not convinced it's going to like take off that quickly, because I think that in some ways, and I think it's almost unfairly so, I think it's one of those technologies that will never be safe enough.
Do you think larger vehicles, like, for example, a self-driving boat, or at least a boat that doesn't need the same kind of crew operating it? Although I don't know how much crew boats really need, but for example, a boat that can what do you call them? A cargo.
Yeah.
The ones that ferry cargo. What do you call them? The huge container ships.
Or container ones, yeah.
Yeah.
So
a container ship that can park itself in the dock.
Yeah.
For unloading, for example.
I mean, again, it's not my field, but I don't know. I like the idea that people are in control of things. Like, I don't know, maybe that's naive, but I think it's. I mean, there are certain things which, of course, there are certain like menial tasks which maybe, you know, it would be better if people who were doing those jobs had something else to go to, like, you know, when it comes to like ship breaking in Bangladesh and stuff like that, it's like, really, we don't want people doing that.
Yeah,
because
anything
it's
that involves
incredibly dangerous.
Yes, hazardous materials
and chemicals and all this sort of stuff, and it's like, yeah, okay, maybe that's not the best for these people, but I don't know. I mean, with things like, yeah, I don't know. It's that kind of stuff. I can see the practicality of it, and I can see it moving in that direction. But, you know, there are certain lifestyles which would disappear. So, like, you know, people who are doing those jobs suddenly are out of a job, truckers and freight operators, and it's kind of like how they feel more than it is how I feel. I'd like to hear what they have to say. I mean, to be honest, with stuff like that, self-driving cars, I'm a bit more like, I like the idea of us being more in control of it, because I think it brings a certain freedom and culture. But I probably, if it ended up becoming mostly self-driving cars, probably wouldn't mind too much. But I do think that self-driving cars will suffer from the fact that they will never be safe enough. And I don't mean that as in the technology will never get to that point. I think it will be that the perceptions of people will not deem it safe enough, because
even if there are far fewer accidents involving a self-driving car, the fact that there's no human in control will make people more frightened.
Exactly. And all it takes is one or two or a handful, and then media will get their hands on it and they'll be like, oh yeah, self-driving car kills blah blah blah, and then once it's out, that cat's out of the bag, then suddenly people will react. And yeah, I think that's what it's going to suffer with.
Possibly. I don't know if that would be something it couldn't get over. But what about transportation where you don't have as many humans around? For example, like the one I gave about boats, freight on the seas. If you didn't need to have a crew on a ship, if it would just take itself to its destination, almost like a probe in space.
I mean, yeah, I again, like, maybe freight operators or people operating those ships would have more to say on it, but I mean, I don't see a problem with that, personally. I mean, aren't they already doing stuff where they're starting to test that technology? Because I think there was a boat which has set sail last week or this week where it was self-driving.
Oh, really? No, I didn't know. As we said at the start, we're not experts in this. We're purely just talking in hypotheticals and giving our own thoughts. I didn't know.
Recent. Yeah, I think that's recent, that it's a self-driving boat which is going, I think, across the Atlantic. I skimmed over it.
What about self-driving trains and subway stations, for example, or even overland trains?
Self-driving trains, I think, is basically on the verge of happening. I think the problem that you'll have, especially in the UK, I don't know about the rest of the world, is that will have big worker resistance.
Yeah, but take the issue of people people's jobs aside, do you think it's an acceptable application of automation?
Again, I with those types of things, I'm neither here nor there. Really, it's not something I'm very passionate about.
I suppose it's not changing the nature of what it means to be human, really, is it?
No, and it's like I'm not a train driver. It's not. I mean, I'd never drive a train in my life. I'll drive a car. That's one thing where it's a bit more like, okay, that's something that I would do, right? And it's something that everyone can do. Not everyone can, not everyone will drive a train. Not everyone will fly a plane. Not everyone will set sail on a freight ship. I don't know. Those are, I suppose, I'm more open to those types of things. I think.
Okay.
I'm not as zealous about them.
Well, back to more conventional ideas about robots. Then, do you believe if robots were created, sophisticated robot helpers, for example, or anything, do you think they should be made to look human-like? For example, if it definitely were going to happen, not a question of whether it should or shouldn't, but if it does happen, should they look human? Or should they be very clearly distinguishable and just be designed purely for functionality?
Well, if it's a robot, so let's say it's something that's performing a function, yeah, I don't think it should look human. If it is purely a machine, have it obviously look robotic. Because because we verge on that weird point. It's like we mentioned it a bit earlier, but the whole like sex dolls thing, right? And having sex with a robot, you start bridging this gap where it kind of muddies the water of you personally. It's not necessarily, the machine is a machine. It's not, let's say this machine that's not artificially sentient. It is a machine which is just responding to a code, doing its code, living in inverted commas by its own nature. It's just doing what it does. But your interactions with that, if it appears human, changes your psyche. It's like how we have a knee-jerk reaction to the idea of what if, if people are violent with sex dolls or whatever it might be. It's like there's something in us which thinks that's wrong, but then it's also an inanimate object, right? But it's because it appears human. And if you as an individual are using that, how is that affecting you as a person?
It's not just being violent with sex dolls. I think most people find the idea of having a lifelike sex doll quite objectionable.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's an unreasonable reaction.
Yeah, but I mean, for the time being, yes. But let's say it gets to a point where these sophisticated, dolls, I suppose, become more available and they are more, I suppose, reactionary. Like, there's all these people talking about, oh, yeah, let's use them in a way, or let's develop these technologies that make them more and more human-like so they appear like they're reacting to you and all of this kind of stuff. And I'm like, you're just there's all this, there's this kind of question of pornography as well and how it's affecting us on a brain chemistry level and this like the whole like dopamine loop and shit like that. And I think it's kind of tying into that problem in that we are supplementing the kinds of things that we have to do to have relationships, meeting people, getting along with them, understanding barriers and how to interact with people, how to flirt and going on dates, all of these things which are important lessons for us to experience and fail and learn from. Suddenly that goes away when you can have this thing which is very human-like that you can have sex with, and it's like, what's that doing? And there are suddenly no boundaries because you can do anything with it. And how is that affecting you as a person? Does that sound weird? But because I think that that's kind of I think that ties into the whole like human appearance thing, because it does affect our perception of it, as we think of it as a person or in the same light as a person.
I don't think it's just human. I think if, for example, you made a little robot that looked like Wall-E from Pixar, people would not like you abusing it, even if it did only have false programmed reactions.
Yeah.
It's a bit like how, for example, people are against the killing of certain animals, like foxes and badgers and things like that, that there is a legitimate reason to eliminate the population occasionally, and things like culling of animals like deer to control the population.
Yeah.
People who don't really understand the reason for it find it objectionable, because aesthetically these are all very pleasant animals. Whereas draining a swamp and spraying pesticide all over the land to exterminate all the mosquitoes, no one objects to that, do they?
Right.
Or going into a swamp like the Everglades, or in Australia where they have crocodile culls, nobody objects to those. Because, well, you could say because these animals pose a danger to people that live in that area or come into contact with them, but it's also because we don't have the same connection with them, because we don't aesthetically find them pleasing. We either find them disgusting or frightening.
Okay, so just going back to like the Wall-E thing, do you think that one of the reasons why people like sympathize with this sounds really dumb, but why they sympathize with Wall-E is because he looks kind of cute?
Yeah, he's got big eyes.
I do think that that's a part of it, but do you think that the way that Wall-E develops in the film showed signs of sentience?
I haven't seen Wall-E for a very long time, and I've only seen it once, but I get the impression that Wall-E is sentient throughout the whole process.
Yeah.
It's just he also has his purpose of making the little cubes.
Yeah. So my view of this, and where it goes into like the questions of artificial intelligence and what I like to call artificial sentience, because I think artificial intelligence is talking about a very broad spectrum of things, from machine learning to all of this kind of stuff, which is like kind of all computing stuff, which is useful technology. It's basically like decision making and asking a computer to make decisions. That doesn't mean it's sentience. I think the question of artificial sentience is a specific issue. And I think no matter what an artificially sentient being looks like, whether it's humanoid looking or Wall-E looking or even, fucking toaster, it needs to be treated with respect, because essentially we've created something that is on the same level as us.
This is why I would say we should never, ever create a sentient robot.
No, but I can see why people would, and why it might even potentially be an inevitability, because people have egos. They want to be God, right? Or whatever it might be. And I don't know if I agree with the notion of that it's like... So I think in some ways we are like God. And this might be getting a little bit out there, but we are like God. Because my interpretation is that God created... If you go from like Genesis, God created humans in total accordance with nature. They were perfect beings. They had no idea, they were just living by their programming, right? And so it took humans, either by seeking or trickery, whatever you want to interpret it as, to learn the knowledge of good and evil, to then feel shame, to feel the wrongs and the ills of the world, to understand that they could do good and bad, and in doing so became more like God. And I think this is one of the interesting things when we, in art and stuff like that, or movies and television, when we depict artificial intelligence or artificial sentience, humans are moving towards trying to find perfection, to be this being which is strong, never ill, post-human. But when we create these beings which embody a lot of those characteristics, they want to be, the way that we interpret it is to be more like us. Like humans were more like, wanted or ended up becoming more like God. Does that make sense?
I think I get where you're coming from.
I think it's a bit
I'm just
wacky,
trying to process it.
Yeah, I think it's wacky, but it's like, it's interesting that we have that interpretation of what artificial sentience would be, in that, you know, in all, you know, Data in Star Trek, fucking whatever her name, Ava in Ex Machina, and
don't get me started on that.
and Blade Runner, right? The replicants in Blade Runner. What do they seek? They seek to be like humans. In the first film, it's like they're trying to seek life. That's what they're doing. They've got a finite existence. It's a short amount of time, but they don't want to die, so they're seeking an extension to their life, and in turn, freedom as well. And at the end, spoiler alert, when what's his name?
Deckard.
No, not Deckard. The replicant.
Oh, Rutger Hauer. I don't remember.
Rutger Hauer's character. Yeah. I can't remember his name, but he, you know, he's dying, but his freedom is being able to choose to not be the monster that everyone viewed him as being, saving the person who killed his lover, and then just telling him his story in the space of that short speech. And in the second film, I'd say that they explore that question of freedom in a lot more detail, because again, spoiler alert, at the end, you know, Kay, the main character, is left with this kind of decision that he has to make: either help the replicant resistance by killing Deckard and make sure he dies, and that the replicant born from Deckard and this other replicant are still, you know, she's safe, or, you know, join the other side, which is like trying to make more of these kinds of things and advance the replicants so that they can replicate themselves rather than having to build them. Sorry, I've gone way on a tangent, but ultimately Kay makes the decision because he's torn between these two sides, and then he decides, no, I'm just going to do the right thing, which is to reunite Deckard with his daughter, which doesn't help either side, but it was his choice of freedom. I think that's the thing, is that with artificial sentience, we always fear that it's going to be our destruction, that they are going to view us as insignificant and wipe us out and realize that we're the problem. But I'd say that if we make an artificial sentient being, it'll be it wouldn't be as kind of,
it wouldn't be as black and white as that.
No, it would be grey, because they would be like us. They'd have the ability to do great good and great evil. They could be an Adolf Hitler or a Bob Ross, you know, it's like... Yeah,
but they also could be the Buddha.
Right, they could be anything in between. And it's that kind of... In some ways, that's beautiful, because it's like, if we created a life form that could do that, that's in some ways incredible, because it's like... But at the same time, we also can do that anyway by having children. So it's always that kind of weird question. It's like, at the end of the day, I think it's always this pursuit of legacy, which is why we try and create these new beings.
It makes you think, what is actually the point in creating artificial life if you're just going to make it just like a human being? Because that's the only way you can really do it, that wouldn't be, where you wouldn't risk creating a rival species, you could almost call it.
Well, exactly, and I think it's one of those weird things, but yet we still have we still feel compelled to do it, and maybe that's, you know, maybe that's it. Maybe that was maybe there is some sort of truth to the story of Genesis, in that it's like there wasn't really a point. Maybe God was pursuing something greater than himself or itself, whatever you want to call it. But in doing so, just created another being that had the potential to become God.
Genesis itself, though, is just an expression of human philosophy, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of meaning that you can get from it. And I think in some ways it's that kind of lesson, right? It's like, well, what are we? Well, is being, having knowledge of good and evil, this idea of being imperfect, is that the point of living? Is being a perfect being that has no knowledge of good and evil, no knowledge of right and wrong? It's a life without color. It's a life of black and white, instead of being, a life of everything in between, all of these things that you do because you want to, not because it's the thing that is in accordance with your nature. And I think that's what, bringing it right back around to post-humanism, I think that's kind of the problem. And I again have the caveat of saying that I'm not a transhumanist, and transhumanists probably will object to this and say, no, we don't believe that you should go too far with it. I just think that's the inevitability of what transhumanism is pushing.
So you don't believe that it would ever be correct to create an artificial sentient being?
It's neither correct nor incorrect. It's, if it happens, how do we process it, right? And I think we can't, if we create a life form that is sentient, that might be made of technology, we cannot treat it like a computer. If it is sentient, i.e. on some sort of scale that we can understand each other on a spiritual sentient level, we have to treat it like an equal life form, because to do otherwise, it's as wrong as slavery and abuse and all of these things, in my opinion, because if we can understand its sentience, then we know that it's, on the same level as us.
What do you class as sentience? For example, would you consider a beast of burden to be a sentient creature?
No, I think sentience is, again, it's one of these weird things, because again, with animals, I think we're learning more and more the more we understand them, and maybe we will find out one day that they are as thoughtful, as sentient as us, or some of them are and some of them aren't. I think whales, for example, are very close to being that. Dolphins as well, we're getting close to understanding what it means to be them and how they behave, and hopefully maybe one day we can communicate with them, which would be crazy, and that's very science fiction. But I guess it would have to be something that is essentially an artificial human. It would have to be something that we can understand, communicate with, and convey our feelings to. I suppose, because this is where it gets onto like a really it's spirituality. It's the spirit of a human being there. Being able to look at something and not even look at it, maybe to talk with it and realize that you're not talking to a machine, you're talking to a person.
So
I don't think we'll know. We won't know until it's made, right? It's one of those things. It has to be something that we know, or that we can just end up having a connection to, friendships and meaningful friendships where we feel the reciprocation of that friendship thing. It's weird, because it's like, maybe we will get to a point where technology becomes so advanced that no matter what it is, it can show signs of these things. It can grow in certain ways if we give it that ability, if it has the ability to expand in that way. And it's in Blade Runner 2049, the Joy character, the holographic woman, she's an interesting example of that, because it's like, well, she's a hologram, but throughout the film, she shows signs of sentience. Throughout the whole film was thinking that she was a spy for the company. And and she ends up like saying, "Oh, break the tracker on this chip so that they can't track you through me," and all of this sort of stuff. But then there's also then the thing where it's like they drop you that thing where she's like, she will be whatever you want her to be. And it's, I suppose, that question of like, does it really matter if she's saying, where does that kind of sentience pour into it? Those are, that's getting into the weird woo-woo stuff, but...
Yeah, what I was going to ask you was, if a machine were created, you can communicate with it, it understands speech and verbal commands, and it can speak to you back. It's got a head with some form of, visual input and output, audio input and output. It has some means of identifying smell and temperature, sense of touch. It's got perhaps not just two, but it's got limbs, and then it has some form of motor function as well. They wouldn't necessarily be legs, because legs aren't necessarily the optimal thing to put on a robot. It might be some kind of caterpillar track that allows you to go upstairs as well as go along terrain. And this thing is intelligent to the point where you can speak with it, but it doesn't necessarily think for itself. Is it acceptable to have those as property?
I mean, if you know for certain that it's not... Yeah, because at that point it's just an intelligent appliance. This is, I think, is the difference between, in my opinion, artificial intelligence and artificial sentience. Because an artificial intelligence can just be something which is, mimicking of behavior, and it just doesn't know what it's doing. It's just following a program.
Yeah, but my question was going to be, do you think people would be able to recognise that? If it was so sophisticated that it could imitate communicating with a human to a level where it seemed like a living being, but it wasn't. Yeah. It was purely just a machine playing out what it's programmed to do. How do you think people would react to that? Do you think you would get a movement saying we can't own these things, we've got to emancipate them, or we should have to treat them in a certain way?
Yeah, you'll always have that, of course. But it's so the interesting thing is, I don't think people would be able to tell too much the difference between it, because especially if you get to a point where they're very like... And again, this is the confusion with like sex dolls and sex robots, more specifically, when they mimic behavior, and especially if it's something like sex, where there's often an emotional connection to it, and you end up transposing those emotions onto this thing. You can see that people will start getting into these situations where they feel emotional towards these things, which are essentially just an object, right? And I suppose the question is that if it is so sophisticated that it can respond to your behavior and mood and all of this sort of stuff, that's when we get into the dodgy grounds of how do we define artificial sentience? And I don't think that we even have, and as much all of the stuff that I said about it, like about the spiritual connection stuff, that's all like personal feeling as opposed to a measurable metric, because I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, we have a measure of sentience or a way to measure sentience. We don't have that kind of stuff. That's science fiction, right? All of the stuff about sentience when it comes to androids and stuff like that, it's all science fiction. There's no scientific study of it, no scientific litmus test, because we've never been here before. We've never had to question the sentience of a non-human being. So we just assume, every human is sentient. How then will we approach these things? Because maybe it is a case that in mimicking this behavior, and it has the intelligence to adapt and come up with its own programming, we can observe these things, but how different is that to our brain processes? We are an adaptable computer, arguably, which can change our behaviors based on the emotions of others, react differently when we see someone's in a bad mood or a happy mood, adjust our behaviors, do things, and they have an effect on us and we have an effect on them, and there's a feedback. Where it will get, I suppose, interest and where the philosophy will lie is in, or the philosophical questions and the spiritual questions and the scientific questions will lie on, where do we draw up these lines? How do we know that an artificial intelligence is sentient or not? I think the stuff about I think the stuff about artificial intelligence is really interesting, but more from less from I suppose a practical sense, and more from like a what if and what are the questions that we're going to have to answer kind of stuff. It's more sort of science fiction, woo-woo spiritual stuff.
Yeah, the thing that interests me is the idea of how you will get people to understand that these things are not something, or not even that, how people will adapt to these things that it could be possible to form an emotional attachment to, even though it's a completely one-way relationship. It's not going to be like with a pet, where the pet likes you back, even if it doesn't quite do it in this sophisticated way that you might. It's a thing that will purely respond based on how it's being programmed to. And it's something that you can turn off or change. And it's purely just acting on what it's been told to do by another human being.
So one thing, and this is where, I mean, it comes back to Blade Runner 2049, with the Joy character in particular. So her programming is to be whatever you want her to be, right? And that's like the tagline. And for Kay, that was basically someone to love and someone to love him, so he could have this relationship. And now, so maybe its source code, it's like the building blocks of its DNA code, artificial coding and artificial DNA, let's call it, is to follow this kind of parameter. But, you know, being what Kay wants it to be is different from being what Joe Bloggs wants it to be, or whoever it might be.
Well, what about being what it wants to be?
Well, but this is the question of how much. So it has this coding in it which drives its behavior, but as it experiences feedback from its environment or from its owner, it's then adapting and changing as well. Do you think that the lines become a bit more blurry when it starts to evolve and develop and become this thing with the more interaction that it has? It becomes something more. Is there a point where it could potentially be showing signs of sentience, even if that sentience is built on this DNA of, I need to be the best person I can be for this person?
Yeah, that's the interesting thought. How are people in the future, if this sort of thing ever happened, how will they deal with that? And what will
it's not only that. Where it interests me the most is, what will it teach us about how our connections are made? Because, you know, again, we have no measure for sentience. We assume sentience in everyone, or every human. And, you know, we have this, what are we going to learn about when we connect with each other? How much of our behavior is modified by someone else and their reactions, their emotions, and how much they're influenced by us on the other hand as well. And are we just beings which feed off of each other and off of things and just adapt in that case? In which case, sentience could just mean being adaptable and being able to change. And even if that's based on a very basic amount of programming, we might discover through some whatever measure or test that we develop that there is sentience in some of these technologies based on those definitions, I suppose. It's wild.
It'll certainly be interesting if it ever happened.
Yeah. Well, that's it. It got a bit. It's a bit woo woo and it's a bit unknown. It's very science fiction, but you know, this is the world that we could be living in, that our children could be living in. I don't know.
We're all in a simulation, though, so it's all irrelevant in the end.
Shit, that's for another Peppermint philosopher. Well, no. Thank you very much for doing this, Rob. I enjoyed it a lot. I feel like you just gave me an excuse to talk a lot, which is always good.
No, that's what I wanted. I'd been reading about this recently, and it just interested me, and you'd mentioned it, and I thought, well, it sounds philosophical enough, even if it is just mostly uneducated rambling, but and just thinking about what could be, even if it is completely implausible. It's just an interesting thought experiment, and I hope people have enjoyed listening to it.
Exactly. I'm about to sneeze. That's all we can hope for, really. Yeah, thank you for listening, if you are listening to the 5 people. Thank you, Rob.
I think those 5 people are me.
Yeah. Thank you for joining the discussion. I'm going to have a wild time editing this.
We finished the last philosophy I was on with an inspirational quote. Have you got one to finish for this one?
All right, we'll leave you off with a quote from one of my favourite people in the world, Jaron Lanier. It's a short one. He says, "The most important thing about a technology is how it changes people." I think that kind of just sums up what we've kind of been discussing. So thank you again, Rob.
I've got a quote.
Oh, yeah? Go for it.
"Happiness is not a place. It's the road you take and who you choose to walk it with." Gandhi.
Amen. Amen. God bless. Right. Everyone take care. See you in the next one. Bye.